Welcome to This Explainer. Let's jump right in, because today we are prying open what is arguably the greatest cold case in historical biography. We're talking about a massive 18-year gap in the life of the most famous person who ever lived, Jesus of Nazareth. Think about it for a second. We have all these incredibly detailed accounts of his birth, right? The manger, the shepherds, the wise men. And of course, we have vivid daily records of his 3 years of public ministry, the miracles, the parables, the cross, and the resurrection. But sitting right smack in the middle of this incredibly well-documented life is a giant, glaring blank space. So today, we're going to sift through the historical and biblical evidence to uncover exactly what happened during those missing years.
18 years. From the time Jesus was 12 years old, right up until he turned 30, the Gospels give us practically nothing. That is almost 2 decades in the life of the Son of God simply not recorded. No stories, no parables, no miracles, no crowds. Just an 18-year wall of silence in the greatest story ever told. And naturally, that deafening silence brings us to an obvious, burning question. Where did he go? Human nature just absolutely hates a vacuum. And into that long silence, people have poured the wildest theories imaginable over the last couple of centuries. You'll hear claims that he went on secret travels to study with exotic masters, or that these lost years hold some forbidden secret the church doesn't want you to know about. So what's the actual truth? Well, our historical investigation starts right now, and we're going to let the evidence separate fact from fiction. Section 1. The Final Sighting. The absolute final glimpse we get of Jesus before the timeline goes dark is in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. Jesus is 12 years old, and his family has traveled to Jerusalem for the annual Passover festival. Here's how it goes down. First, the festival wraps up and the caravan heads home. Second, Jesus just stays behind in Jerusalem, but he totally forgets to tell his parents. Mary and Joseph actually travel for a full day before they even realize he's not in the group. As you can imagine, they are frantic. They rush back to the city, and finally, 3 agonizing days later, they find him. Now, what is really fascinating is the scene when they actually find him. He wasn't lost. He wasn't scared. He was sitting right there in the temple courts, surrounded by teachers, listening and asking them questions. Luke points out that everyone who heard him was just amazed at his understanding. Even at 12 years old, he was dropping the jaws of religious scholars. And when a highly stressed out Mary asks why he did this to them, young Jesus gives this absolutely stunning reply. "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Already, at just 12, he possessed this crystal clear understanding of who his true father was and what his ultimate purpose would be. But almost immediately after this profound realization of his divine purpose, Luke just closes the scene. The curtain falls. Luke chapter 2 simply says, "Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." He went down to Nazareth, he was obedient, he grew. Boom. Just like that, the next 18 years are swept up into a single, straightforward sentence. The very next time we see him, he's 30 years old and standing in a river getting baptized. Section 2, Gathering the Clues. So does that mean we know absolutely zero about what happened next? Not quite. The biblical record actually leaves us 4 very specific clues. Clue number 1, he grew in wisdom and stature. This lets us know these were years of ordinary, healthy human development, physically, mentally, and socially. He experienced a very real, normal, human young adulthood. Clue number 2, he lived in Nazareth. Clue number 3, he worked as a carpenter. And clue number 4, he was part of a typical family. He was the eldest brother to siblings named James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. He grew up in a busy, working-class household balancing daily life and real responsibilities. And this sets up a really fascinating tension. You have the ultimate divine purpose of the Son of God completely contrasted with the absolute obscurity of Nazareth. Scripture constantly calls him Jesus of Nazareth, but Nazareth was just this tiny, humble, entirely unremarkable village in Galilee. It was so insignificant that there was literally a running joke recorded in John's Gospel. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? This wasn't some booming cultural hub. It was a place of total local obscurity. Now, let's zoom in on that third clue about his profession. Over in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, he's referred to as the carpenter. The specific Greek word they use there is tekton, which translates to a craftsman or a builder who works with wood and possibly even stone. Matthew's account also calls him the carpenter's son. So this proves he spent these silent years working hard with his hands, learning his earthly father Joseph's trade, and doing grueling physical labor. Section 3. Fact versus fiction. You know, for some people, the idea of the Son of God working quietly as a carpenter in a backwater town just isn't dramatic enough. And because of that, over the last couple of centuries, we've seen this explosion of sensational myths. You've probably heard them. Claims that Jesus secretly traveled to study with gurus in India, or spent time in Tibet or Egypt, or even visited Britain with Joseph of Arimathea. But the historical reality, it's a completely different story. Scholars overwhelmingly reject these travel theories for one very simple reason. There is zero credible historical or biblical evidence for any of them. Literally none. These stories pop up centuries too late, they rely on unreliable sources, and they aren't backed up by anyone who actually knew him. Let me give you a perfect example of how these myths catch fire. The most popular theory out there, the idea that Jesus traveled to India and Tibet, actually traces back to the late 1800s and a guy named Nicholas Notovich. He claimed he stumbled upon this ancient manuscript in a Tibetan monastery all about a Saint Essa studying with Hindu and Buddhist masters. It sounds like an amazing historical find, right? Well, it was a complete hoax. A highly respected scholar named Max Muller looked into it. The monastery itself publicly denied that any such manuscript existed, and they even denied that Notovich had ever set foot in their building. No document was ever produced. The entire India theory rests on a totally fabricated hoax. But even beyond debunking late 19th century hoaxes, we actually have the ultimate biblical proof against these travel theories right in the text. When Jesus finally began his public ministry and returned to teach in his very own hometown, how did the locals react? They were astonished, and frankly, they were offended. They looked at him and said, "Wait, isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? Aren't his brothers and sisters right here with us?" They were shocked precisely because he was so familiar to them. So the crucial takeaway here is this. The historical evidence points home, not abroad. Think about it logically for a second. If Jesus had just spent the last 18 years backpacking across the globe, studying under exotic foreign masters, his own neighbors wouldn't have been blindsided that he suddenly had all this incredible wisdom and power, and they certainly wouldn't have dismissed him as merely the carpenter. Their reaction of sheer offended astonishment only makes sense if he had been right there in Nazareth the entire time, living a totally ordinary life right in plain sight.
Section 4. Sanctifying the ordinary.
So, now that we know where he was, the big question is, why? Why would God choose to leave these specific years out of the record? Well, consider the sheer scale of the silence. The creator of the universe in human flesh spent roughly 90% of his earthly life in total obscurity. 90%. No fanfare, no dramatic miracles, no cheering crowds. Just decades of ordinary life in a town so small, people literally mocked it. Only 10% of his life was spent in public ministry. The exciting truth isn't some secret ancient world tour. The profoundly exciting truth is that he was just home.
And this brings the history directly to you and me. Why does this matter for us today? Because by living this way, God entirely sanctified the everyday, mundane tasks of human life, going to work with callous hands, being faithful in the small things, taking care of your family, and doing your job with unseen excellence when absolutely nobody is watching. I mean, Jesus spent far more years being a faithful carpenter than he ever did preaching. He modeled humble, faithful, ordinary godliness. It tells us that the everyday life you might sometimes feel is totally meaningless was lived by Jesus himself, and God counted as highly, highly valuable.
Furthermore, these were 30 years of absolute necessary preparation. Before the 3 years of public work that would literally change the world, there were 3 solid decades of just getting ready. He was growing in wisdom, deeply knowing the scriptures, learning obedience, and developing character. The perfect Son of God submitted to imperfect human parents and honored his family. This hidden season wasn't a waste of time. It was the essential foundation for everything that followed.
Which leads us perfectly to our final thought for this explainer. Are your hidden years just preparation? You know, the wild series out there try to make those 18 missing years exotic and mysterious. But the real, historical story is just far more beautiful. God completely, ordinarily, and humbly became one of us. He knows exactly what it is to grow up, to wait, and to live an unremarkable life. If the Son of God spent decades quietly preparing before his public work even began, how much more should we value our own hidden, slow, and unseen seasons? So whatever ordinary season you find yourself in right now, know this. He's been there. He's sanctified it, and it is profoundly valuable. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this completely changes how you view your own hidden years.